questions I get asked most often from yoga teachers is how to protect their students' wrists. It's common knowledge that people complain about achy wrists in yoga, whether they're ranging from wrist injuries to just kind of that nagging sensation in the wrist. There's a huge spectrum. Regardless, I think we can encourage some healthier wrist loading, which is a departure from perhaps the alternative that we're used to, which is to offload the wrist, unload the wrist, right? Let's talk about how we can actually load the wrist to prepare it for more time on the mat, more complex poses, and poses that require weight bearing on the wrist. So in poses like quadruped, plank, downward dog, handstand, all those types of poses, any weight bearing pose on the hands, we tend to be in a lot of extension, a lot of wrist extension. For many people, it'll be the end range wrist extension. No big deal. But what I see is that when we tend to go to end ranges, we tend to just hang out there. So we might be spending time there, but we're not actually engaging the muscles of the wrist to support the wrist in that position. And I'm really focused on engaging the wrist flexors, which we tend to think of training the wrist flexors only in flexion, but we actually need to train the wrist flexors in this lengthened range and extension as well. So let's look at how we can do that with a bolster. Come to a position kind of on your knees where your hands will be resting on the bolster. So it can be, a modified quadruped position. And for the purposes of today, if you have the range of motion, we'll put the shoulders right over the center of the hand. So right over the arch of the hand. If you don't have that range of motion, then no big deal, then you can just have the shoulders a little bit further back. And I'll bring this up in a little bit, why we are kind of working in that position. So my shoulders are over the center of the hand. And now if I just let my weight sink into the bolster, like as if I were to come to a plank, right? So I really push down into the floor, you can see how my wrist sinks. So I'll come to the edge just so you can see a little better, but my wrist really sinks down. And yes, that does increase wrist flexion a bit, or wrist extension a little bit, but also it just shows me that I'm just resting my body weight in this position. So from there, again, I'm going to let myself sink down. Shoulders are over the center of the hand. From there, I'm going to engage the muscles of wrist flexion. Whew, I'm already trembling, burning in the forearms, it's good. So that I can feel now that the weight is kind of evenly distributed across the hand. So I'm actually using my fingers quite a bit, and I'm pressing with my knuckles quite a bit, but it's not just about pushing the knuckles into the ground, it's actually about trying to flex the wrist. Again, the cue is quite different. So here I'm just sinking into the wrist, here I'm just pushing the knuckles down, and if you can see by just pushing the knuckles down, it actually makes my wrist kind of achy. And what many of us will do is to, instead of pressing the knuckles down by using wrist flexion, we'll actually shift the shoulders further forward, distributing the load over those knuckles, and then what's happening is we're actually just going deeper into wrist extension and not actually gauging the muscles of wrist flexion. So one more time, you come to this position, shoulders over the center of the hand if that's possible for you, and then you engage the muscles of wrist flexion so that your wrist gets just a little bit lighter. Now, I'm working really hard, but if I wanted to challenge myself, I could do that in a plank, and it's very, very hard, but such a good learning tool because I can do the same thing on my mat, same type of work, where I'm now really understanding what it feels like to support the muscles around the wrist in that position. So give it a go. Let me know how it works. Be sure to always load slowly and progressively.